All right, folks, continuing with the notes for Chapter 11, covering Section 2 in this video, and having a very quick overview of the concept of ethics. It's going to seem almost like we're doing an introduction to philosophy course as we go through this section, but it is important for us to understand some of these concepts, and it helps to kind of give feet to some of the different ways of thinking in terms of how we approach certain things in life in general, but in our case, in broadcasting as well. So let's talk about the word ethics. It comes from the Greek word ethos. It originally meant an abode or an accustomed dwelling place. It's a place where people would feel comfortable, kind of the space and the place that one lives in. So in like manner, the study of ethics can be thought of as helping us to make decisions with which we are comfortable. Our ethos is kind of our natural dwelling place in terms of how we live our lives and how we think that life ought to be lived. If you want to think about it in more formal terms, ethics addresses the question, which human actions are morally permissible and which ones are not? Or in even more simpler terms, what's the right thing to do? That's what we're talking about when we're talking about ethics. Ethics and law are related to each other. Both limit human activities, but they do so in very different ways. Laws are enforced by sanctions and penalties. They are imposed on us, usually by government entities. You could even kind of take that and talk about it in terms of rules when you're with a particular organization. The school has rules that you have to follow. When you work, your workplace has rules that you have to follow. Ethics are enforced by our moral sense of the proper thing. So it's not so much that if you break an ethical rule that you're going to go to jail or you're going to get punished in a formal sort of way. But ethics kind of goes against the kind of underlying sense for some of what it means to be a human, what it means to live in society with others, and that sort of thing. And the punishments may not necessarily be concrete. They could be more punishments in dealing with other sentiments and that sort of thing. So there's two main schools of thought when it comes to ethical theories. There's the teleological and the deontological theories when it comes to ethics. Teleological theories. Teleological comes from the Greek word teleos. It is a word that means an end or a result. So teleological looks at things in terms of what is going to come of a particular situation. So this theory of ethics is one that measures the rightness or the wrongness of an action in terms of its consequences. The idea of cause and effect. If you do X, then Y will happen. And is Y a thing that we should look at positively in an ethical light or not? Okay? Teleological, looking at the end results, looking at consequences. Deontological theories, from the Greek word deon, meaning duty, don't really concern themselves so much with consequences. More so, they look out the duties that are morally required of all of us. The source of these moral obligations can come from all sorts of different places, from human reasoning, from our society that we live in, the supernatural, i.e. religion, or just from the human conscience, regardless of a perceived benefit to society. So in other words, it's more that idea that the consequence is not so much what we need to look at. It's more just that there's a certain standard that needs to be upheld. Those that believe that there are certain absolutes that need to be of prominence would be more of a deontological sort of thinking. Now, some of the theories that fit within these two main frames of ethical thought. First, let's look at a couple of teleological theories. Utilitarianism is a theory that holds that a person should act in a way that it produces the greatest possible ratio of good over evil. In other words, one should make the decision, the consequences of which will yield the greatest good for the greatest number of people, or will do the least harm to the fewest number of people. Now, with all these theories that we're going to talk about, there's an illustration that gets carried out after the explanation of each theory. Starting on page 272, I would encourage you to kind of read through that. It gives various examples of how these different theories would play out. Another teleological theory is egoism. It's a case in which action is judged to be right or wrong in terms of consequences for one's self. So we're not looking at the greater good, we're looking at the individual good. What's best for numero uno? What's in it for me? Now, that sounds rather selfish, and you can make certain arguments in that way. However, with the idea of egoism, it is not completely devoid of kindness or thoughtfulness to others, because the theory here, the thought here, is that doing what is best for you is frequently also going to entail doing what is best for others. If it's good for you, it's good for somebody else. That's the idea of egoism. Now, a couple of deontological theories here. Categorical imperatives. These are theories in which one acts only on those principles that he or she would want to become universal law. These are those kind of absolute sort of theories. What's right is right and that is that. Regardless of what the outcome may be, there's a principle that needs to be upheld, and dag nabbit, you better uphold that principle. And then another deontological theory is the golden mean. This one argues that the proper course of action is between two different extremes. So you're using ideas here like moderation, temperance, equilibrium, harmony. It's saying that you're not going to polarly go into one decision full tilt or another decision full tilt, that there may be a certain amount of compromise or a certain meeting in the middle in terms of how you handle a particular situation. Okay, a couple more theories for you here. The cultural ethics theory, which is grounded in society as opposed to being grounded in nature, holds that an individual is shaped by his or her culture. These would be things like your upbringing, how your parents raised you, what sort of societal norms are involved, where you go to school, where you go to work, the town that you live in, all those sorts of things. Now, in broadcasting, owners and managers may observe and consult others in the industry before making an ethical decision. It's that idea of what would so-and-so think? What did this particular person teach me? What's been my experience in living in this particular culture, and what would others in my situation do? So, cultural ethics theory. And then situational ethics. This argues that the traditions and norms of society provide inadequate guidance because each individual problem or situation is unique and calls for a creative solution. This has the idea behind it of looking at each thing as its own particular thing, and each particular thing needs its own solution because there's generally several variables that play into what the proper action to take should be. Okay, let's talk now about doing ethics. A knowledge of ethical principles is useful for all those entering the radio and television profession. It is important to have some sort of predefined standard in place when a quick and difficult ethical call is required. So this is the idea that you don't start into something cold and start from ground zero each and every time a situation comes up. There's going to be some sort of philosophy, some sort of system of belief, thought, rationality, whatever you want to call it, that people as individuals would have and that an organization would have, including an organization that is part of the broadcast industry. So having that sort of base to start on is going to be important for guidance into various types of ethical issues. A personal code of ethics assures an individual of some measure of consistency from one decision to the next. Again, it's not just the idea of having a place to start, but it's going to provide a foundation for kind of an overall pattern of how choices are made from one situation to the next, so that there's a certain reliability in terms of how a person or how an organization should act or react. Media professionals are often asked to explain or defend their decisions to the public. A knowledge of ethical principles and the techniques of moral reasoning can give those explanations more credibility and validity. That means that there was a thought that went behind something. That thought was put into place prior to an event happening, and it creates that sense that, well, you kind of know what you're doing when you do a certain action or react in a certain way. Finally, good ethics and good business generally go hand in hand, at least in the long run. It is much more assuring to do business with an organization that you kind of understand where it is they're coming from and why they do what they do. So in that aspect, it is very important, not just from the perspective of, providing things to the public, but also as a business organization as well, to be able to make money in the economic landscape. If you're interested in looking at certain ethical standards that have been around for a while, that some broadcast organizations use, you'll find those in your textbook on pages 275 and 276. Now, this is all fine and dandy to talk about, but when we try to put it into the real world, it can be rather complicated. It's not as easy as just making decisions and sticking with them, at least all the time. Rarely do professionals have the time to reflect on their decisions. When things happen, there needs to be an action taken, and it needs to happen yesterday. You don't have oodles and oodles of time to ponder the meaning of life and its consequences and all that, as many great philosophers have had the opportunity to do. Many broadcasters and cablecasters enter their profession without a personal code of ethics, which kind of complicates things. If you don't have your own philosophy of life, the philosophy of what it means to be a good person or to act in a responsible sort of way, that's one of those things that you might want to do. That idea of finding yourself, who you are, and not just who you are in terms of what you do or how you look, but who you are in terms of your character, in terms of your thought process, in terms of your reasoning and your purpose and all those sorts of things. They're going to help to formulate how you put together your own personal philosophy of ethics, and that may impact the way that you work within a certain organization. Many codes of conduct are written in broad general terms and may have little relevance to the individual. This is one of those cases where it's kind of hard to put blame on an organization for this, because on one hand, you do want an ethics code to be somewhat general so that there's room for making decisions on a case-by-case basis. But if they're so general that it's kind of hard to understand exactly what the thought process or rationale should be for something, then perhaps it's time to revisit putting together that code of ethics. Finally, many ethical problems exist at the corporate level as well as to the individual level. We talked about that earlier in the chapter. Sometimes it's problems that start at the very top that can complicate things that are done on the individual job description level. Now, a final word about ethics. Ethical problems are not like algebra problems. There's no one answer that everyone is going to come up with. 2 plus 2 equals 4. We all agree on that. The rest of life isn't necessarily as easy to come up with a straight answer on. So as a result, they necessarily leave room for personal judgment. And again, we got to keep that in mind, that there are certain things that are not necessarily black and white when it comes to providing an answer and an action step to a particular situation. Ethical decision-making is more an art than it is a science. It encourages careful analysis and thoughtful, systematic reflection before making a choice. So it begins with what theory that you hold on to the strongest, and thinking about things like the impacts on yourself, impacts on other people, impacts on the company that you work for, and impacts on the world at large. All those things come into play, as well as deciding if there is an absolute standard in terms of certain principles that, regardless of what may happen otherwise, that just need to be held onto. All those things are personal decisions and company decisions, and it's going to be an ongoing thing to decide what the right answer is for each individual thing that happens. So there you go. There's chapter 11 and your very brief introduction to philosophy. So go ahead and finish up the notes and the study questions, get them turned in, participate in the online discussion board, and reach out to me if you have questions, concerns, anything about the chapter. If there's certain things that you'd like to talk about in greater detail, be happy to do that with you. As always, make sure you're monitoring Cougar Mail and Blackboard for any updates and changes in the class.